This episode is called Bad Blood. It was February 24th, 1991, and Jennifer Jackson was at a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. She was in labor, and she was about to give birth to her second child. And she was doing it alone. Her boyfriend, and the father of this child, Brian Stewart, was an Army medic, and currently he was deployed to the Middle East, so he couldn't be there for the birth. Brian was heartbroken that he couldn't be there for this big moment. He was so excited to become a dad. Before leaving for this deployment, he'd given Jennifer a framed poem he had written about becoming a parent. And whenever they spoke on the phone, Brian couldn't wait to hear about Jennifer's latest ultrasound and how big the baby was getting. And through it all, Brian had just one request about the baby boy who would be born while he was overseas. He wanted Jennifer to name this child after him. Brian knew that there was a chance he could be killed in action, and so he wanted to guarantee that this baby always had a connection to their father. Just then, a huge, painful contraction brought Jennifer back into the present, and her doctor told her, "Come on, one more push, just one more push." And a few minutes later, Jennifer was holding a screaming little baby boy, Brian Jr., in her arms. 9 months later, on Christmas morning, Jennifer sat on the couch helping baby Brian open his presents, while Brian Sr. sat next to them sipping coffee. Jennifer looked over at him and squeezed his leg. Ever since coming home a few months ago, Brian had been this amazing father and partner. He did what he could to help with the baby, and he was extremely attentive to Jennifer's needs. He loved to hold her hand and talk about their future together. But Jennifer felt like she was still getting to know Brian. They hadn't been dating that long before she got pregnant and he went off to war. So when he sometimes got moody and walked out in a huff, Jennifer didn't really know what to think. But with Brian's charming smile and good looks, Jennifer could never stay mad at him for very long. And after all, he did always come back, which was more than she could say for her previous boyfriends. The father of her first child was hardly in her young daughter's life at all. But on this particular morning, their first Christmas together as a family, Brian began acting pretty strangely. When Jennifer handed him a present for the baby and asked Brian Sr. to help open it, Brian Sr. refused. And then a dark expression came over his face and he got up off the couch and began pacing. Jennifer had no idea what he was doing, and at first she thought, maybe he's having a flashback from his time in the Middle East. And so she asked Brian, hey, are you okay? But Brian just kept on pacing. And then at some point, Brian came to a stop, he took a deep breath and looked Jennifer in the eye and said, "I don't think I'm Brian Jr.'s father." Jennifer was totally stunned. She asked Brian where this was coming from. Then she held the baby up and asked how could he believe this child was anyone else's but his. The baby looked just like Brian Sr. But Brian Sr. refused to listen, and he ultimately stormed out of the room, shouting that he knew the truth and was not going to raise another man's child. Jennifer didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow after him to their bedroom and get him to calm down, but Brian seemed so angry, she didn't know how he'd react if she just kept on insisting the baby really was his. So she just hung back and tried her best to comfort Brian Jr. while Brian Sr. packed a bag and left the house. About 2 months later, Jennifer was at home balancing her son on her hip while she tried to cook some lunch for him and his sister. Adjusting to life as a single mother had been very challenging for Jennifer, and she wasn't getting much help from anybody else in her family either. Jennifer's sister was around a lot, but she was also a drug addict. And so a lot of the times when Jennifer's sister came over, she'd come over with a friend or two and they were high on heroin. Sometimes Jennifer even caught her sister and her friends injecting drugs in her house. Jennifer hated all the substance abuse around her kids, but at the same time, she just didn't have the heart to stop her sister from coming around because it meant a lot to her sister to visit the kids. Every now and again, Jennifer would try calling Brian for help, but whenever he actually answered the phone, he would just yell at her about how Brian Jr. was not his son. Jennifer did her best not to let it bother her and just focused on trying to raise her kids as best as she could. But as Jennifer cooked up some mac and cheese, she noticed little Brian's breathing suddenly sounded different. He was wheezing and it seemed like he was having a hard time catching his breath. Jennifer had no idea what was going on, but just from the looks of it, this didn't look like a common cold or something else that was easy to explain. This looked pretty serious. And so as her little boy continued to struggle to breathe, Jennifer just picked up her phone, called her mom, and told her to meet her at the hospital. Then Jennifer bundled up her kids and drove to the nearest emergency room. A few hours later, Jennifer was sitting beside little Brian's crib at St. Joseph's West Hospital in Lake St. Louis. The baby was hooked up to an IV, as well as all sorts of monitors that measured his vitals. Thankfully, though, he was now breathing normally. Little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Linda Steele Green, was treating the baby for pneumonia and asthma, a chronic disease that can make breathing difficult. The doctor explained that Brian Jr. had an asthma attack, but she had given him some treatments to stabilize him. For Jennifer, this diagnosis was both relieving and kind of daunting. She now knew baby Brian would be okay, but asthma was a condition that her son would have to live with for the rest of his life. Jennifer thought about the baby's father, Brian Sr. Even though he had not been involved in his son's life since he moved out, Jennifer figured she should let him know what was going on. So she used the hospital room's phone to call another hospital where Brian Sr. worked as a lab tech. A few moments later, one of Brian's colleagues answered the call, and Jennifer told them to please find Brian Stewart because his son was at St. Joseph's Hospital. But the person on the other end sounded confused. They asked Jennifer if she was maybe looking for a different Brian Stewart, because the Brian Stewart that worked there had never said anything about having a son. Jennifer almost slammed the phone down in anger. She knew Brian was in denial about being little Brian's father, but this was just disgraceful. Trying to stay calm, she assured the colleague that, oh yes, she had the right Brian Stewart and to please relay this message as soon as possible. After Jennifer hung up, she did her best to put Brian Sr. out of her mind. For now, the only thing that mattered was her baby boy getting better. The next morning, Jennifer was leaning over the edge of little Brian's hospital crib as he slept, holding his hand. The breathing treatments were working, and once the baby woke up, the doctor said he was well enough to go home. Jennifer got up to go pack some things when she suddenly heard someone walk through the door. She turned around, and much to her surprise, Brian Sr. was standing there with his white lab coat folded over his arm. He said he was there to see the baby. Jennifer was definitely surprised to see him. She didn't really know how she felt about it, but at the same time, she was grateful that her ex-boyfriend obviously cared enough about their son that he was here now to visit him in the hospital. Brian Sr. placed his lab coat down on a chair and then walked over to Jennifer and gently took Brian Jr. from her arms. Brian Sr. smiled at the baby and then said to Jennifer that she should take a break and grab a snack. Jennifer smiled and took him up on the offer and headed down to the hospital cafeteria. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer was done with her break, so she stepped back into the elevator and rode it upstairs towards the pediatric floor. When the elevator doors opened, Jennifer heard the unmistakable sound of her own child screaming, and so Jennifer took off running towards her son's room. Once she got there, she found Brian Sr. sitting in a rocking chair, looking terrified and very confused. He was holding little Brian in his arms. The baby was sobbing. Jennifer tried to run over and grab her son, but before she could, nurses rushed in and put little Brian back in his bed and began taking his vitals. They said his blood pressure and pulse were much higher than normal. A moment later, little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Steele Green, came in to examine him. Jennifer stood off to the side, biting her nails nervously. Finally, after doing the exam, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer that she couldn't explain why little Brian's vital signs were so off. He was stable now, but whatever had just happened definitely was not an asthma attack. So a decision was made to keep Brian Jr. in the hospital for further observation instead of discharging him like they'd planned. Jennifer turned to Brian Sr. and asked him what happened while she was gone. He just shrugged. He said everything was going fine, Brian Jr. seemed perfectly happy, and then all of a sudden, he was just crying his lungs out. Jennifer asked Brian Sr. if he wanted to stay a bit longer, but he just shook his head and said no. He said he had a lot to do and that he wouldn't be much help here anyway. Then he picked up his lab coat, and after waving goodbye to the baby, he left Jennifer alone to comfort their son. Jennifer stayed in the room with Brian Jr. for the next few days, as doctors continued to monitor his progress. Finally, Dr. Steele Green said it was safe for them to go home now. As Jennifer strapped her son into a stroller, the pediatrician told her to look out for asthma symptoms, but beyond that, her baby boy should be just fine. 4 years later, in the spring of 1996, Jennifer ran a bath for Brian Jr., who was now 5 years old. After the frightening hospital visit when he was an infant, Brian's childhood had actually gone as normally as it could. But he hadn't actually seen his father again since that hospital visit. Brian Sr. continued to deny that he was the child's father, and he very clearly did not want to be involved in this baby's life anyway. Jennifer thought ultimately it was for the best. It was Brian Sr.'s loss. Jennifer and Brian Jr. were getting along just fine by themselves. Once the bath was ready, Jennifer squirted some soap on a washcloth and began to get Brian cleaned up. But as she scrubbed him, she noticed something strange. They'd gone to the park earlier, and Brian had gotten a couple of scrapes and cuts like all kids do, but they looked really red and swollen. And some fresh mosquito bites that he had gotten at the park looked huge and inflamed. It was like his body was not properly healing itself. Jennifer helped her son out of the bath and put some bandages on his wounds, and as they walked to his room to get ready for bed, Jennifer noticed Brian Jr. was now walking strangely, like he was having trouble keeping his balance. Jennifer held her son's hands to try to help him walk, and she noticed his palms felt clammy. So Jennifer took his temperature, and she was shocked to see the thermometer read 105 degrees. Even though Brian Jr. had just been in the bath, Jennifer knew Brian's body temperature should not be this high. This was a potentially lethal fever, and he needed medical attention right away. Once they arrived at the hospital, little Brian was taken straight to the pediatric intensive care unit. Jennifer did her best not to panic, as a team of doctors, including Dr. Steele Green, hooked up Brian Jr. to a bunch of monitors and stuck needles in his arms for IVs and blood tests. It was nerve-wracking, but Jennifer was glad that Dr. Steele Green was there. The two women had become friends after Brian Jr.'s hospital stay when he was a baby, and Dr. Steele Green had continued to see the boy for regular pediatric appointments. Jennifer was very confident that Dr. Steele Green would be able to help her son. By the end of the day, little Brian had been stabilized, but the doctors still didn't know what was wrong with him. Dr. Steele Green promised Jennifer she would run every test she could, and hopefully they would have an answer in the morning. That night, Jennifer lay awake on the couch inside of little Brian's hospital room, listening to her son's heart monitor beeping. Jennifer had been trying to stay optimistic, but it was now clear that little Brian was seriously ill. But still, Jennifer knew that Dr. Steele Green would do everything she could to figure out what was wrong. Just as Jennifer was beginning to fall asleep, little Brian suddenly shot up in bed, crying and screaming for his mother. Jennifer rushed over to him and tried to calm him down, but he just kept on sobbing and begging his mother not to let him die. Jennifer promised her son that he'd be okay. The doctors would figure out what was wrong with him, and they would fix it. She said this over and over again and held her son close until finally little Brian did drift back to sleep. A few days later, Jennifer sat beside little Brian's hospital bed, gripping his hand as he slept. Ever since he'd been admitted, Jennifer had barely left her son's side. Little Brian was in extremely bad shape, and Jennifer didn't want to be away from him in case something really bad happened. Over the past few days, little Brian had grown weaker and weaker as his organs began to shut down one by one. His skin had grown jaundiced and yellow because his liver and spleen were not working properly, his ears were infected, and his digestive system had almost entirely shut down. And the doctors really had no idea why any of this was happening. They had tested little Brian for everything they could think of, even diseases that had been largely eradicated or only existed in other countries. Everything had come back negative. As Jennifer went down her mental checklist of all little Brian's symptoms, trying to come up with some explanation that kind of made sense, she heard a knock at the door. Dr. Steele Green opened it up and stood in the doorway with a very somber look on her face. She walked in and took a seat in a chair next to Jennifer. Jennifer could see tears forming in the doctor's eyes, and a pit began to form in Jennifer's stomach. She knew that whatever news Dr. Steele Green had, it would not be good. In a quiet voice, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer they had finally figured out what was wrong with little Brian. It was something so unlikely, she would have probably never figured it out on her own. The only reason she'd even thought to test for it was because the possibility came to her in a nightmare. As she slept, a series of frightening images came into her mind. She saw blood, then she saw needles and test tubes, then she heard the squeak of a rocking chair and the sound of a baby crying. Then she was wide awake, sitting upright in her bed, finally having an idea of what might be wrong with little Brian. Normally, she wouldn't follow her dreams for medical advice, but Dr. Steele Green had been out of ideas, and she was willing to try anything at this point. So they had gone ahead and tested Brian for this really specific, terrible disease, and it would turn out the doctor's nightmare diagnosis was correct. Brian tested positive. Now there was no more sugarcoating. Little Brian didn't have long to live. because he'd just tested positive for the HIV virus and it had turned into full-blown AIDS at a time when there was basically no treatments for the disease. HIV can prevent the body from fighting off even the slightest infection. The disease that the virus causes is called AIDS, and 30 years ago, it was an absolute death sentence. Dr. Steele Green estimated Brian had maybe 5 months left to live. Jennifer was absolutely speechless. Panic raced through her mind as she wondered how this could have happened. Jennifer didn't know much about HIV, but from what she did know, you got it from having sex with someone who had HIV, or you got it from sharing contaminated needles. But of course, Brian was doing neither of those things because he was 5 years old. But then Jennifer's mind went to a dark place. Her thoughts turned to her sister, who was a heroin addict, who still sometimes used drugs in their house. Jennifer had done her best to keep Brian away from her sister when she was doing that, but she wondered if somehow maybe he'd gotten poked with an HIV-infected needle when she wasn't paying attention. Or, much, much worse, maybe a stranger who was infected with HIV had done the unspeakable and sexually abused her son. Jennifer looked over at her son and just began to cry. Her children were absolutely everything to her. And so for now, Jennifer knew she had to focus on just finding a way to keep her son alive. So she turned to Dr. Steele Green and told her that she was willing to do whatever it took to help Brian. 2 years later, Jennifer stood in her kitchen helping her son, Brian Jr., wiggle into a special backpack. Brian was miraculously still alive, but just barely. This special backpack he was wearing was connected to a feeding tube that led into little Brian's stomach. He needed a liquid diet to survive because he basically always vomited if he ate solid food. But both Jennifer and Brian agreed that it was a worthy trade-off because he'd beaten all expectations and lived long past the 5 months his doctors had estimated. But it wasn't easy to get by. Because Brian required so much help every single day, Jennifer had been forced to quit her job. And because her ex-boyfriend, Brian Sr., still wouldn't send child support payments, Jennifer and her kids had to live off of food stamps and other welfare programs. And just from a medical perspective, it took a lot of work for Brian just to make it through each day. After getting his backpack secured, Jennifer walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a massive medication tray. She carefully doled out 23 different pills for Brian to take. Once Brian had taken all of his medications, Jennifer took him by the hand and they went outside to wait for the school bus. Because there was still so much fear around AIDS, little Brian was not allowed to ride on the standard school bus with most of the other kids. Instead, he had to ride on another bus for children with special needs. Jennifer's heart broke just thinking about the bullying Brian had to endure at school. Bullies called him all sorts of names, and they mocked him for the bulky hearing aids he now had to wear all the time after losing 80% of his hearing. But through it all, Brian remained relentlessly optimistic. Jennifer was so proud of his ability to remain positive despite all the suffering he'd endured, and so Jennifer did her best to not let her own fears and her own anxieties get in the way of her son's childhood. Now, just keeping her son alive basically consumed all of Jennifer's waking hours. But she also had one other major concern about her son, figuring out how he'd actually been infected with the HIV virus in the first place. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up in front of their house. Jennifer hugged her son goodbye, and then he climbed on board the bus and the bus took off, and then Jennifer went back inside her home. After she got dressed, she called Detective Kevin Wilson down at the St. Charles County Sheriff's Office. For the past 2 years, Detective Wilson had worked tirelessly to try to figure out how Brian had gotten HIV. The detective had tested the blood of at least 30 people who had spent time with Brian Jr., including Jennifer's sister and her friends, but none of them had been HIV positive, so this very likely ruled out transmission from drugs. The detective had also found no indication that little Brian had ever been sexually abused by anyone, so it was highly unlikely he got HIV that way either. But there was one lead that Detective Wilson was still working on, and that was what Jennifer was calling him about today. Detective Wilson assured her that he was close to cracking the case, but there were still some loose ends to tie up. This was a delicate situation, and he had to be absolutely sure he was right before he made his move. Before they hung up, Detective Wilson promised Jennifer that little Brian would get the justice he deserved. A few months later, in December of 1998, Jennifer sat down in the witness stand at the front of a St. Louis County courtroom. Her hands shook as she looked to her right at the judge. Right out in front of her, she saw there were news reporters, jury members, and at the defendant's table, her ex-boyfriend, Brian Stewart. He stared at her with cold, hateful eyes. Jennifer swore to tell the truth, and then took a deep breath. Speaking into a small microphone, she explained that she broke up with Brian Sr. in 1991. She said they fought bitterly over child support payments, and at one point, Brian even threatened her. Brian insisted that Brian Jr. was not his son, and Jennifer should stop asking him to give her money because, after all, Brian Jr. wouldn't even live past the age of 5. Jennifer testified that way back when little Brian was first treated for asthma, his father showed up at the hospital totally unannounced and convinced her to leave the room to go on a break. And when she came back from that break, their son was screaming. Brian Sr. had left quickly, and that was the last time he ever saw his son. Little Brian seemed okay for the next 4 years until he suddenly developed confusing and terrifying medical problems. Jennifer's voice broke as she recounted all the painful memories. The prosecuting attorney thanked her, and she stepped down from the witness stand. Then the attorney turned to the jury and explained that the answer to this mystery could be found in one place: Brian Sr.'s job. Brian Sr. worked as a hospital lab technician who was responsible for drawing blood from patients. He had access to tons of blood samples, including blood from people who are sick with infectious diseases. Brian Sr.'s work was the missing puzzle piece. With it, the prosecution could explain exactly what happened to little Brian. It went like this. Brian Stewart was an abusive boyfriend who never wanted to be a father, even though he pretended to be very enthusiastic at first. Once he moved out, he was angry over child support payments, so he hatched a plan to make them go away. On the day that 11-month-old little Brian Jr. was supposed to leave the hospital, Brian Sr. showed up carrying his lab coat. Inside his coat pocket was a vial of blood he'd stolen from the phlebotomy lab where he worked. He told Jennifer to go take a break and he would watch the baby, and then while she was gone, he used a tiny butterfly needle to inject his infant son with that contaminated blood, hoping it would eventually kill the baby. That blood came from a patient who was obviously HIV positive. So for the next 4 years, little Brian lived with the HIV virus in his body until it transformed into full-blown AIDS. And by the time the doctors figured out what was happening, the disease had already progressed, seemingly beyond hope. Ultimately, Brian Sr. would be sentenced to life in prison. The story of what he'd done to his own baby son made international news. People were absolutely horrified, but they were also inspired by Brian Jr.'s resilience. In the years following the trial, Brian Jr. continued beating the odds. He made it through elementary and middle school. At 13, he began to find comfort in Christianity, which he said allowed him to forgive his father. Incredibly, Brian Jr. is still alive today. His diagnosis seemed like a death sentence in 1996, but with new scientific advancements, today, AIDS is actually a fairly treatable disease. Brian Jr. now works as a motivational speaker, and he runs a nonprofit called Hope is Vital that aims to reduce discrimination against those living with HIV and AIDS. Lawrence Daquan Davis, who just went by Day, graduated from a military-style high school in 2009. Following his graduation, he enrolled in Job Corps, which offers young people from a low-income background free career education and vocational training. During his time in the Job Corps program, he trained as a medical assistant, and then after successful completion of Job Corps, he applied for numerous jobs all over the place, but no medical facility was ready to hire him. For a couple of years, Day consistently tried to apply to medical facility after medical facility, but after everybody kept denying him, mostly because he lacked experience or he lacked the credentials they were looking for, he eventually realized that, it's probably not going to happen, that he should look into some other career field. And so he decided he would join the military. But when he took the military entrance exam, he failed the math portion, and so was told he can't join the military. And so Day decided he would study and retake the exam, but he knew in the meantime he needed to make money right now. He was the oldest of 4 siblings, and his mother, who had had him when she was only 14 years old, was out of work, and Day's father was not in the picture. And so Day felt like it was his responsibility to step up and help support his family. And so he did what many other people in Jacksonville, Florida did when they were struggling to find work. He went to a temp agency. Temp agencies are staffing firms that contract with employers who are in need of temporary, part-time, or seasonal workers. The temp agency hires someone like Day and then ships them off to one of their client companies when they need work. Conceptually, this employment structure works great for all parties involved. People like Day get to have a paycheck really quickly, and the companies have their short-term employment needs met on the cheap. But there's a loophole. Temp workers are legally employed by the temp agency, not by the physical location they go to do work, known as the direct employer. This is a very important distinction because it means the temp agency is the one that has to pay for insurance for the temp worker, not the direct employer. Therefore, if a temp worker gets hurt on a temporary job, the direct employer's insurance costs will not spike. Instead, the temp agency's insurance costs will spike, meaning the direct employer knows they can be kind of reckless with their temporary workers because there's not a big penalty if they get hurt on the job. This loophole doesn't mean much if the temporary worker is being asked to be a receptionist where it's totally safe. But this loophole matters a lot when the temp worker is asked to do something dangerous, like work with industrial machinery inside of a factory. On August 16, 2012, Day received a call back from the temp agency he went to, telling him that they had a job for him. It was at the Bacardi Bottling Corporation in Jacksonville, Florida. They told him he needed to be at the warehouse that day at 2:45 p.m. for training, and then at 3 p.m., 15 minutes later, he would start his first shift. After Day agreed to do this job and hung up with the temp agency, he excitedly called his mother to tell her that he had finally landed a real job. In fact, this would be the first job he had ever had, and so he was just very proud of himself. And his mother was very proud of him too. And so Day asked her, would you give me a ride to Walmart so I can pick up some things I need for work? I need a white shirt, I need khaki pants, I need these special industrial boots. And so his mom said, absolutely. She swung home, she picked him up. The pair went to Walmart, they picked out his whole outfit. And then from Walmart, his mother just drove him directly over to the Bacardi factory to begin his first day. Day went inside, and just a couple of minutes later at 2:45 p.m., he was shown a very short safety video. That would be all the training he received. Day was brought into Bacardi to be a warehouse clerk, which basically meant he would do odd jobs around the factory that didn't require a lot of skill. And so after he watched this training video, he was told to head down to the bottling line to watch all of the bottles as they went by to make sure the labels were put on properly. Before he headed down to the floor, Day stopped in the bathroom and took a very proud selfie of himself to commemorate the start of his first shift at his first job ever. He sent the picture to his fiancée, put the phone in his pocket, and then headed out the door down to his first workstation. There was a section of the factory that initially Day was not working in, where there were these huge machines called palletizers that took the finished bottles of rum and stacked them into what are called pallets so they could be shipped off to stores. These palletizers are two-story pieces of heavy machinery where the top story is just catwalks where the palletizer operator can manipulate the machines, and then the first floor is where the rum actually comes into the machine and is moved around and stacked on these big metal platforms. Sometimes as the rum comes in on the conveyor belt, they will fall off and smash on the ground. This started to happen about 90 minutes after Day took that selfie in the bathroom. The palletizer operator, after seeing the broken glass, called out over the radio that he needed a temp worker to come into that section of the factory and help him. Day's supervisor at the bottling line told Day to stop what he was doing and go over and help pick up the glass. There is a security camera video of Day running into the section of the factory where all the palletizers are, making himself obviously available to help pick up this glass. And the operator sees him and immediately turns, he's up on the catwalk, and he points down towards the first floor, clearly telling Day, you need to get down there, that's where the glass is, go sweep it up. Day immediately walks around and goes down to the first floor of this machine and begins working. A couple of minutes later, Day comes back up to the catwalk and he looks visibly confused. He's scratching his head and just everything about his body language says something is wrong. Now, we don't know for sure what Day says next because there's no audio in this video, but he's clearly asking a question to the operator and also to a supervisor who's now in frame. And it looks very much like he's asking clarifying questions, like he's confirming, you want me to go down there, right into that space down there and clean the glass up? That's what you want me to do? And clearly the operator and the supervisor have no time for questions from Day. They just want him to get this done. And so there's kind of a tense interaction between the two parties before Day ultimately just decides, okay, I'll just go down and do what they asked me to do. And so Day again goes back around and you see him go down into the first floor to continue cleaning this glass. And after a few moments, the supervisor and the operator, who don't realize Day is still down there, they turn the machine back on. And after a couple of seconds, they hear a scream coming from the first floor. They look over the railing down there and they see Day. The broken glass that needed to be cleaned up was located directly underneath this metal platform that lowered the built pallets that weighed 2,000 pounds all the way down to the floor before they were shipped off and out the door. In order for Day to actually get down in there and clean this glass up, he needed to crouch way down and practically crawl on his stomach to get into this tight space. While he was in there, the machine turned back on again, and he wasn't able to crawl out fast enough before this platform and 2,000 pounds of rum pressed him into the ground. It would be the equivalent of crawling on your stomach into the bottom of an elevator shaft and then having the elevator car come down and mechanically be lowered flush to the bottom with you in there. The palletizer operator and the other supervisor immediately spring into action and try to reverse this platform up off of Day, but they can't do it. And so they grabbed a metal pry bar and they tried to pry the platform off of him, but that didn't work either. And so finally, when emergency crews did show up and were able to get this platform up off of Day, it was too late. He was already dead. In any factory where a worker needs to go inside of a machine that could maim or kill them if it turned on, they go through what's called a lockout or tagout procedure before stepping foot inside. All it is they completely incapacitate that machine. Day had no idea about lockout tagout procedures because the only training he got was a 15-minute video that didn't touch on them. And so although Day definitely had reservations about going down underneath this machine, he wanted to make a good first impression on his first day of work at his first job ever. And so he pushed his reservations aside and went down below, believing the supervisor and the operator were looking out for him. When in reality, they, like all of the other managers and supervisors inside of this warehouse, had been trained to prioritize productivity over safety. And so while they definitely knew the lockout tagout procedures, they chose not to do them because that slowed down productivity. And so in this unfortunate example where Day is kind of like a second-class citizen within the Bacardi plant because he's a temp worker, his safety was thrown out the window in favor of reaching a quota, and it got him killed. Bacardi was ultimately fined $192,000, but after they improved their safety compliance, their fine was reduced to $110,000. Bacardi also paid Day Davis's family $250,000. The staffing agency that employed Davis was not hit with any fines, and to this day, they are still sending temp workers to the Bacardi bottling factory. Our next story is called 18 Inches. On August 15, 2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. On that particular day, Ron knew before he could do anything else on the job site, the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. And so as soon as he got to the job site that morning, he went in the back of his truck and pulled out a 6-foot-tall stepladder and a drill, and then walked into that particular room. Once inside, he opened up his stepladder and placed it where he wanted it, and then he tested his drill by squeezing the trigger a couple of times, and so once he knew that worked, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps, not to the very top, but just a couple of steps, and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. Now, at first, these holes were very easy to punch through. But when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room where he also needed holes in the ceiling, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. And he didn't really get it because he knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through. And it was just wood, so it really should be going through. And so he decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He needed to really press on the back of this drill while he's pulling the trigger. And so instead of standing on the second or third rung of the 6-foot-tall stepladder, he walked to the very top of the ladder, the kind of dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on any ladder. And from there, he was in a better position to really push this drill into the ceiling. And so he gets in position and kind of feels like the ladder's fairly stable, and then he lines up this drill where he wants it. He begins squeezing the trigger, and at the same time, he really pushes with all that extra leverage into the ceiling. And as he does that, he feels the drill starting to go into the wood, but at the same time, he's pushing so hard that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet at a bit of an angle. And at some point, he pushes too hard, and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron instinctively tried to throw the drill away from him, which is a common practice amongst construction workers. You don't want to land on your gear, it could hurt you. But he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him, and even worse, the drill, when it hit the ground, basically right underneath him, it landed on its back with the drill bit pointing straight up into the air. And so when he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. And so this 18-inch long, 1.5-inch in diameter drill bit impales his head, goes right through his eyeball, goes through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. And so Ron, he hits the ground, but he's conscious, and so without even rolling over, he just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill, and then he traces to the drill bit, and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head, and he feels the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest, and Forrest, who was in a separate part of the job site, he hears Ron screaming, and so he runs over, he goes in the room, and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. The bit, the 18-inch bit, is still poking through his head, and so Ron is looking at Forrest and then turns to the side to show him that he's been fully impaled by this thing. And Forrest is totally horrified at what he's seeing. He can't believe Ron is even alive, but then Forrest jumps into action. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit, and then he tells Ron to stay where he is, and then Forrest ran out of the job site, ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive in an ambulance a few minutes later, and they find Ron sitting next to Forrest, just with this drill still in his face. Ron is very obviously in shock because he's not making any sound, he's totally conscious, but he's just kind of staring blankly, holding onto this thing. And so the paramedics, they go over and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital, and from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. And so when he arrives at this larger hospital, they rush him immediately to the operating room. And at first, the surgeons attempted to cut off either end of this bit, the part that's sticking out the front of his eye and the part that's sticking out the back of his head. But they realized once they did that, there would still be this huge piece of bit that was stuck in his skull, and that would obviously be a huge problem. And so after thinking about it, they decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. And apparently, as they were doing that, Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes about how somebody needs to come in here and take a picture of me. I probably look so great. And so miraculously, Ron would survive, and he would not even be paralyzed. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye, but all things considered, Ron is okay with that. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. Had it punctured his brain when it went through, that almost certainly would have killed him. But by some unbelievably slim chance, it did not, and he survived. The next and final story of today's episode is called Robot 23. In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of sites around the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz had finally come to their decision. Tuscaloosa, Alabama would become the site of the first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was a historic day, not just for Mercedes, but also for Alabama. At the time, the state had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and so residents of Alabama were hopeful this factory would create hundreds of new jobs. But what actually happened shattered their expectations. Immediately following this announcement by Mercedes that they were going to set up shop in Tuscaloosa, 3 other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all announced that they too would be setting up shop in Alabama. And so these 4 major factories all came with jobs of their own, and each of these factories attracted dozens of other smaller factories that supplied the parts to put together these cars. And so all these smaller factories came with additional jobs. And so this one decision by Mercedes didn't just create hundreds of new jobs in Alabama. It created tens of thousands of new jobs all across the state. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a big part of her life. Her family worked in the factories, and as a kid, every day when she went outside, she would see dozens of these 18-wheelers come bombing down the road in front of her house, carrying car parts on their way to one of the many factories. Regina was a reserved and quiet kid. She loved to read, she was a good student, and she loved animals. She would take in stray animals. Any animal she could find, she would bring it back home to her house, but her favorite animal was her dog, who she named Cow. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician, and so after high school, she enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant, with plans to eventually transfer out to Auburn University, where she would finish her degree and then hopefully go on to medical school. But while she was at the community college, she fell in love with a local boy named Dan, who she had actually gone to kindergarten with, and before long, the two were engaged to be married. The young couple wanted to move in together, but they didn't have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she didn't have an income, and Dan barely made minimum wage working as a shelf stalker at Walmart. The only way they could get their own place would be if Regina dropped out of school and got a job too. This was a difficult decision for Regina because she still wanted to be a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was really excited about her future with Dan, and so she thought, I'm only 20 years old, I can always come back and get my education later and become a doctor later, and so in January of 2016, she disenrolled from her classes and went out looking for a job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters currently worked. It was called Agin USA, and they supplied parts to Hyundai and to Kia. Regina's mother told her that it was not a great place to work, that she had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories, and the pace and pressure was unbearable. Car parts suppliers are known for being under intense pressure to reach their quotas every single day. Failure to do so, even by a slim margin, can lead to massive fines imposed on them by their customers, like in this case, Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure on these suppliers often leads them to overwork their employees, like Regina. And the employees develop a sort of production at all costs mentality because they see their employer only cares about hitting their daily quota. And so employees will cut corners and skirt safety regulations to ensure they stay on their quota. But after Regina's mother approached her and told her about all these horrible things about the auto parts supplier factories, Regina said, "I got bills to pay." She'd already moved into a house in southeastern Alabama near the Agin factory. She was living there with her fiance Dan and her beloved dog Cow. She had bought herself a brand new car, which she was very proud of, and she had found herself the perfect wedding dress that fit her just right, but it cost $4,000. And so Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money. When she first started at Agin, she was put on temporary status, which meant she only made $8.75 an hour. In order for her to make more money, she would need the company to shift her to full-time status, which came with a $1.75 per hour raise. Determined to show the company she was worthy of being shifted to that full-time status, Regina volunteered for 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. But by June of that year, after 6 months of this hellacious work schedule, Regina was over it. And she went to her parents' house, she laid on the couch, and she told them that she just couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, she was going to start looking for other work, preferably something she could do part-time, so she could go back to school and continue to pursue her career as a pediatrician. And her family was relieved and excited to see her get her life back to normal. A few days later, on June 18th, Regina, who was still employed at Agin, was working the day shift at the factory. Her job that day was to oversee a robot that would weld on these metal pillars onto the front right and the front left of the car, where these side view mirrors would attach to. This robot looked like a giant arm protruding from the ground, where at the end of the arm, where the hand would be, were two welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. The robot was surrounded by this huge chain-link fence that was there specifically to keep the employees from getting too close to it while it was in operation. Regina would oversee this robot via a computer screen outside of that cage. At some point in the afternoon, as Regina is monitoring her computer, it comes across the screen that there is a stud fault on Robot 23. Now, her robot was not Robot 23, it was the robot adjacent to her station, but the person in charge of overlooking Robot 23 was a part of her team, and her team had a daily quota to hit. And so having Robot 23 down directly impacted Regina. And so Gina stepped away from her computer, she walked over to the outside of Robot 23, she spoke to the team member, and they decided it was best to just call maintenance and have them come by and try to clear the fault. A security camera inside of the factory was aimed down at Regina and her coworkers as they stood outside of the metal cage around Robot 23 waiting for maintenance. But after quite a while, maintenance still hadn't shown up, and it was obvious the team was getting very anxious. They know every second that robot was not operational, they were hurting their chances of reaching their quota, which the company would be very upset about because they'd be hit with a big fine. And so at some point, Regina just kind of says, screw it, I'm going to fix the fault myself. And so she picks up a small tool that looks like a screwdriver, she opens up the cage to Robot 23, and she steps inside and walks right for the stem of the robot. When she gets over to it, she has her back to the robot's arm that's behind her, and she begins doing something with her tool to the stem of the robot. And whatever she does, it works because the robotic arm behind her springs into life and immediately goes back into the action it had been trying to perform before it failed. And that action involved swinging back in Regina's direction. And when it did, those two 4-inch welding tips at the end of the robotic arm were driven directly into Regina's back, impaling her. Her coworkers saw it happen and hit the emergency shutoff switch, but it didn't power down the robot until after it had thrust Regina across the cage and pinned her up against the wall. And so with this robot now powered down, the welding tips were now run all the way through her upper back and pressed up against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall like tacking up a piece of paper with 2 tacks in a corkboard. She slouched over, but her eyes were wide open. She was conscious, but she didn't make a sound. Nobody knew how to release Regina from the robot's grasp. And so the team leader hopped on a forklift and sped across the factory floor towards the break room. He ran inside, he found a maintenance worker, and he dragged him out. They got on the forklift. The maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap, and they sped back across the factory towards the Robot 23 cage. When they got there, they took this maintenance guy and basically thrust him into the cage and told him to get Regina out. But the maintenance worker didn't speak any English. He was terrified at what he was seeing Regina the way she was. He didn't really know how to fix the situation. Tempers were flaring, and before long, the maintenance worker just got overwhelmed and ran away. When emergency crews finally arrived several minutes later, Regina was still pinned by this robot. She was conscious, her eyes were wide open, and she was still totally silent. And they were able to get her off. They sent her to a hospital, and then she was transported to a trauma center, but it was too late. The damage that had been done to her by getting impaled by this robot was just too extensive, and she died at the hospital. It would turn out Regina's company, Agent, had not properly trained her or any of her coworkers. Agent's policy was to hire people and as fast as possible, get them on the floor, helping them reach their quota. And so as a result, Regina and her team members had no idea about a so-called lockout procedure, where if you're going to go inside one of these robots' cages, you need to make sure the power switch has been locked out, meaning it will not turn back on if you fix the fault that has caused your robot to stop. All Regina and her coworkers knew is that the most important thing is hitting your quota at the end of the day. And so that was the reason Regina went inside of the cage, and that was the reason Regina was killed. Agent ultimately pleaded guilty to not having properly trained Regina, leading to her death, and they paid the family $1.5 million.